Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome here at this talk at the. Is this still the library or? It's still the library. Okay. Welcome here. This conversation we're going to have with Qing Wang, and thank you very much for coming. And thank you very much also to Heidi Lehner and your concert and the Money Museum for helping us put this together. For those of you who don't know, just a quick introduction about Qing Wang. Qing Wang is an award-winning journalist, podcaster, and social media influencer. She's committed to helping the world understand China and China the world. She has 10 years experience covering political, economical stories with a cross-border perspective, but very often, if not always, with a human-centered approach. And she currently leads the Weirdo podcast, which has been around for 6 years, almost 6 years now, right? It's a very popular Chinese language podcast with over 1 million followers on the various platforms. And with that audience and with that network, Qing also is a very active participant in Chinese debates on topics like social justice, feminism, globalization. I've been reading this last time we spoke, Qing, last fall, and you were included in the top 100 thinkers. Do you remember who said that? I mean, I can agree, but do you know who gave you that distinction, like top 100?
So it's by a Chinese social media platform called Weirdo, and it's the equivalent of Twitter or X in China, and they have a new competition every year, and yeah. So
I see. Okay. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of it all, I want to start with this. And that's a quote from a geopolitical analyst talking about the three-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine earlier this year. And this is one of those analyses that, even though it's probably right, I mean, it's very clinical and it's very like, you can read a dime a dozen. And this person from the Atlantic Council said, despite mounting casualties, escalating offensives, neither Russia nor Ukraine is poised for a decisive victory, making a fragile ceasefire and a continued attritional conflict the most likely scenarios, as both sides seek leverage for negotiations. So it's a very, not to diminish it, but a very typical geopolitical analysis of the situation there now. But then we go to another quote from a geopolitical analyst talking on this very same war. And that person said, quote, "We hesitated a lot while preparing this conversation. I feel what I'm saying might be quite jarring for the audience. I'm disappointed, but not surprised," this geopolitical analyst. And she continued, "Now 3 years on, over 1,000 days later, it seems to be all unfolding as predicted. Each step deepens one disillusionment with the international order, with modern values, and even human nature itself." And that's Lu Chen, a Chinese geopolitical analyst, speaking on your podcast, The Weirdo. And to me, that difference in approach to that very clinical geopolitical analysis that is also valid. And this geopolitical analyst on your podcast, really bringing in that human perspective and that how does it make her feel to be thinking about the war in Ukraine. And I thought that's almost the crux of your podcast and your work over the past years. Simple question, but do you agree with that assessment?
well, I feel very touched and flattered that you said so detailed, like in such a detail, the thing that's said on my podcast. And I would say I agree, or at least that the vision me and my co-founders at the podcast, the goal that we want to achieve, which is bring the human angle to what is going on in the world. And actually, before coming here today, I was told that this event is like fully booked, it's sold out, and I had to ask myself that question. In Switzerland, it's such a it's a country that is so different from China. With this group of audience, like, what do you want to hear from me? What can I bring to the conversation? And I know, at Asia Society, you have loads of experts who are, specialized in different fields, trade, military, foreign policy. And so I think I probably don't need to repeat any of that. And I'm no also not capable of, providing all this like strategic analysis of, what's going to happen in the world. But I think what I can bring here today is probably some, a bit of like human conversation, human touch, and some perspective from China, from some specific group of Chinese people that I feel the human-centered approach is actually what we need both in China and in here. Like talking about what's going on in the world politics, it's quite depressing nowadays. And I think probably a lot of you would share the same feelings looking at what is going on in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Yemen, even in the US and in China. And it could be quite depressing to only look at those perspectives, data, big analysis. But I think what I am often empowered through my work as journalist and podcast is that it's like through those like human conversation, human exchange that give me a lot of energy and optimism. So that's also what we want to do with my podcast, the Weirdo podcast.
The Weirdo podcast. What's with the name?
Well, yeah. So it's a.
Is it only for weirdos, or what is it?
I will say before answering that question, let's define what is weirdos.
Right.
And I have to say, to myself, I do feel some little, weird moments now and then, living in the society. On the one hand, you have a good career, good education, living in a good part of the world. And so you are seen as some sort of a mainstream. But on the other hand, I believe everyone will have some sort of moments in your daily life that you feel a little bit unfit and weird in the society you're living in. So by having the name the Weirdo podcast, we are trying to speak to a group of audiences who feel that they don't always fit in the society. It could be, a certain kind of lifestyle choice they make, for instance, in China, where I come from, for instance, like women in their 30s, like me, who decide not to have kids or who postpone the decision of having kids are seen as weird in China. Because then, what about the family value? And then also for people who work at some, big organizations, state-owned enterprise, but holding like critical views about the government, they also feel a little bit weird in their surrounding. So I think by having the name in the podcast, we want to speak to this kind of people that feel that they want to pursue a kind of independent thinking. And furthermore, we want to create a safe space for people who feel like that. Probably not all the time, but some hours in a day to feel that there is actually a safe space for independent thinking and non-mainstream thinking like that. And in addition, we also try to facilitate a conversation that question what is weird and what is normal, and reflect and rethink about our society nowadays and what in what condition it could be better in the future.
Sounds a bit surprising, I should say, that you define one of the aspects of your podcast being a safe space for independent thinking. That's not something we associate with Chinese media. Is that naive of me? Or?
And thank you for asking that question. And I think it's totally a legit and a reasonable question to ask. And on the one hand, I totally understand. Well, this perception come from about media landscape in China. I spent the last 10 years. So I was born and raised in China, and I spent last 10 years in Europe and trying to covering like, what I felt to Chinese audiences. So by being here, I do understand, in this, if we divide our world in a category of democratic society and non-democratic society, then China, of course, will be considered in the category of a non-democratic society. Therefore, I think there is the question, often asked, does independent media exist in China? Does safe space exist in China? When I tell, friends or Europeans that, I'm a journalist from China, I remember once, one of the European friends actually blurted out to me and saying, "Oh, the species of Chinese journalists doesn't even exist," because it sounds so counterintuitive. But on the other hand, I want to say, through my own experience of practicing journalism and engaging with my audiences, I feel the understanding of Chinese media landscape need to be updated and improved. Of course, there is like censorship, there is like governmental regulation in China in terms of media space. But on the other hand, China isn't North Korea, and China isn't Soviet Union. And between the governmental regulation and what individual does in their life, there is a huge space.
Right.
Which offers a lot of, I would say, leeway for individuals to explore what is possible. One thing that I often tell my European friends is that, China is a country with more than 1 billion people. So you can't find proof or examples to support almost every argument you are thinking about. You can always find an example that is, supporting this argument, but also countering that argument. So, and then don't underestimate the individual efforts in China that, people still have the desire for independent thinking and have the desire for enriching content and have the desire to know what's going on in the world and have the desire to have a good and intellectually fulfilled life.
Right.
So I think I see my podcast in that category. So we're trying to explore the space in that big gray zone together, of course, with tens or hundreds of my fellow journalists and podcasters. And I think the effort from this group shouldn't be underestimated.
Clear. I want to go back to the basics a little bit. You mentioned you've been living here in Europe for, I forgot again, 10 years?
10 years,
10 years, yeah. You moved to the Netherlands to study in Leiden, right?
Yeah.
Then worked for, it's called Weirdo. It's kind of like public broadcasting system for an international audience based in the Netherlands. And then you had the move of explaining China to a European audience. But then after a few years, you thought, you know what is going on in Europe is difficult to understand for a Chinese audience by now. And this was right around Brexit 2016, then came the first Trump presidency. And you mentioned, you noticed among your Chinese network friends that there's a sense of disappointment and wonder, like, what is going on there? And is this what democracy delivers? And then you thought, I need to switch. And instead of explaining China to Europeans, I need to start explaining Europe to Chinese people. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you felt that switch was necessary? What kind of unclarity did you want to clear up?
So maybe a little bit more introduction of my own background. I grew up in China. I was actually born in a very poor part of China. This is a province called Weirdo, and it's one of the poorest region in China. And coincidentally, landscape is quite similar to Switzerland here. It's a very mountainous area, so being here in Switzerland, I feel quite at home on the one hand, because in the Netherlands, you don't have any mountain here. It's like two flat, one hill, but on the other hand, the difference is very obvious. I think Guizhou province, the GPT per capita is like probably 1% of in the Switzerland, or even less. And so, growing up as a mountain people, I always have the desire as a young girl to go to see what is on the other side of the mountain. So then for college I went to Beijing, and then the fancy part of China, and then I came to Europe 10 years ago thanks to a scholarship provided by the Dutch government, and I managed to finish the master degree there. And I mean, nowadays, if you probably if you see Chinese students or Chinese young professionals abroad, most of them are probably from this kind of upper middle class family in China. But I'm probably not one of them, and not from the fancy part of China. And so I really have always been asking myself, what is on the other side of the mountain? What is the goal being there, and what do you want to do with the thing you see there? And I think for a long while, for people like me, this generation of Chinese, we have that. We've been always having that kind of vision that the West is something we want to look up to, we want to learn from, and we want to know how a society with good governance, with good democracy, with freedom of speech, with social welfare that covers everyone, that each individual can have a decent, dignified life, what kind of society that is, and is there a chance that China can become one of them? And I think that was basically the dominant narrative for a whole generation of Chinese people ever since the the opening up of the market in late 80s, early 90s, and then following the China joining the WTO in 2002, and then that was the stage when China actively want to embrace the world order and they want to be a part of the world. And then in that world, I think American or the Western style democracy would seen as the, a sort of like the beacon of democracy. And so I think, today I'm just a note today I see a lot of new friends, but also my very old friend from college. T is also here, and I'm just feeling this like connection of all the bits of my life, and I think we both grew up from that generation of Chinese people who aspire to learn more from the West. And I think what happens in 2016 was quite a shock. Not just to the West, but also in China. What happened in 2016 was the Brexit and Trump getting elected. And before that, in Europe, around that time, I was working for a Dutch media organization in the Netherlands. And from 2014, 2015, you start feeling the tension of the Syrian refugee crisis. You walk around the city center of Amsterdam, homeless refugees were everywhere. Train station was flooded with the human flow, and after that, or around that time, in different European countries, you see the terror attacks happen now and then in Paris, in Brussels, in Germany. And then Brexit and Trump 1.0 happened. And I think around that time, the disappointment and also a sense of disillusionment became very strong among the Chinese intellectual groups, and this group who used to think as long as China is keep being opening and keep learning from the West, eventually we're gonna become a society like Switzerland. But apparently that was not the case, because after 2016, people start questioning themselves. If the end goal of democracy is Brexit and Trump, is that really what we want to end up with? And so around that time, I felt a sense of responsibility of explaining what is actually happening in the West to audiences in China. Not all audiences in China, but the group of Chinese people who are curious and who are willing and who are capable of about the world and want to engage with the world, who doesn't want a decoupling to happen. He wants China to be a part of the world instead of enemy of the world. And so I decided to switch my career after that, switching from working for the Dutch media organization to a China-based organization as a Europe correspondent. And I also feel the necessity of living and covering Europe, is that in China, another dominant narrative about the West is that when they talk about the West, American seems to be the only relevant example at the West, the only version of the West. And living in Europe for years, I realized that's definitely not the case. And I think Europe has a lot to offer. So that's why I decided to make that switch, and it's still what I do nowadays. Yeah.
I think you could probably double your audience, well, maybe not in numbers, but by also starting a podcast explaining Europe to Europeans by now. Because I appreciate that many in China don't understand anymore what's going on here, but I think many here kind of struggle with that every now and then as well. If I may be blunt, I'm not fluent in Chinese, so I can't listen to your episodes just from A to Z, understanding everything. I've done some research, and you've very handily transcribed 3 recent episodes to English, available on the Asia Society Switzerland website. I want to get to those 3 episodes and why you chose those later, but throughout the episodes I was able to consume, it's all a bit bleak, isn't it? It's a bit depressed, and the audience as well, the reactions online are very much like, yeah, I feel lost, I feel disillusioned. You mentioned in the conversation we had earlier that phenomenon that's been well documented here as well. How especially younger generations are disappointed, not just in the West, but in their own country and the economic opportunities they expected to have. And it goes way beyond the lie flat thing of a few years ago. It's really almost an active rise of cynicism. And it's no longer the goal to be the next Jack Ma. It's just like, well, what is it actually? What are we here for? That's very much like the tone I'm getting from many in your audience. Am I being too bleak? Is it, or is it really that cynical? Has it become that cynical?
Yeah, I definitely agree with your analysis of the bass tone of our podcast. It could be depressive, and actually, some friends recently told me that, oh, Qing, I feel like, I really want to keep up with what you're doing. I think it's great, but every time I listen to it, I get a little bit depressed.
Right.
And I'm already having a very busy job, and after I come home, I just want to watch some, funny, hilarious TikTok video about cats or dogs, and I don't want to carry that weight with me. And I think that's totally fun. But I think what we want to provide in the podcast is trying to still keep reminding people that things like this do exist.
Right.
Not everyone has to listen to every episode, or not everyone. I mean, it's about whether you decide to engage or not. And I always see, there are different ways of engaging with the society you are living. You could choose spend your spare time watching really light and relaxing video. I do that all the time because
you do?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I have to confess that I don't listen to my podcast that often because I need some, rebalance in my life too. But when I have the energy, I want to put it into create things that I think really matter. There got to be someone in society that keep working on those things, and plus I don't think my work is the heaviest one, because for instance an incoming episode we're going to do in the coming week is about a lawsuit, some massive arrests in China about a group of young women writers who have been writing erotic novel on a website. And that generate a lot of public attention in China. And this episode will be a conversation with two lawyers who have been working on those cases and trying to improve the lawmaking in that sphere. And compared to those lawyers, our work as media, as a journalist, is very light. Like we aren't really the one who argue or defending the court, and so I feel like it's heavy. It's critical. It's not a podcast that you listen and afterwards you feel like good or meditative, or it's not a podcast that you can listen while you sleep, for instance.
Right.
No.
I'm not sure a fan of existential nights.
Maybe you can listen to when you are doing your gym, like then you get or marathon. Just joking.
It's funny you mentioned earlier in a coffee we had a few days ago that you sometimes host events for your listeners in Europe or maybe elsewhere as well. And that someone met you for the first time and said, "Hey, you're actually funny, because when I listen to your podcast, I often have to cry." And then you said, well, and then you thought, well, maybe I should try at least one episode a month. I need to lighten it up a bit.
Yeah.
And then immediately after that, you said to me, yeah, that's not really working out, or it's difficult to find something light to talk about once a month. Is that still something you strive for, or do you say like, well, we're just going to go with what we know best, which is the tone we have?
I think the tone of the voice of our podcast also resonates with what's going on in the world. And I remember there was one period that was particularly depressing. It was during COVID, especially in 2022. And so for that whole year, I felt the podcast has become a place for group therapy. Right. People want to know what is going on in the situation. People want to know that when you are in that heavy lockdown, you want to get connected with other people. And I think in 2023 we got lighter a little bit, because like that was when the world started getting a little more opening up, and the COVID shock seemed to be over, or at least over.
Especially in China, of course, where the strict measurements came later and stayed later than in Europe.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I think it was during that period I realized this. It was like a different phase for China and Europe during the COVID lockdown. Right. In 2021, China was pretty normal, with the whole country being locked up, and but in Europe it was still like quite a lot of like curfew here and then. But in 2022, it was reversed, and so I do feel like our podcast resonates with what's going on in the world, and also another dimension is this convergence of private life and public life. I was trained as a journalist, and during my journalistic work, what you can talk about is, I would say, some very standardized or very set of things that the newsroom expect you to write about.
Right.
So there isn't that much room for personal feeling, or if you quote one argument for an opinion, you need to sort of have a balance of it. Yeah. So because you are supposed to be objective and neutral, and I think in our podcast, one of the ideas of actually starting this podcast is that it's not meant to be another legacy media, and the conversation we had is not meant to be another think tank seminar. We want to address how people actually think and feel about certain issue. Like, for instance, when we talk about the Trump's administration in the US, it feels quite remote here.
Sure.
But for me, I do have like friends and my former students, whose visa are deeply in trouble. And so they reach out to help. They're like, oh, can we talk about this on your podcast? And very, very brilliant and diligent Chinese students, and whose visa just got canceled. And that is the kind of, it hit me as well.
Yeah.
It hit me in a different way compared to when I read it from the news. So then I realized, okay, there is, or there should be, space or channels to talk about this kind of convergence between private feeling, so personal feeling, and also the public interest. And in podcasts, because I know Remco is also running a great podcast at the Asia Society, you probably also understand, the voice actually created a different kind of connection with your audiences. So I think that's what we feel at the podcast as well.
Speaking of connections, I really enjoyed reading those 3 transcripts you translated for us of recent episodes. One we already talked about a bit was about the Ukraine war. Then there's 2 others. One is on AI, which could be about anything nowadays, but I really loved the matter-of-factness of the conversation, was because things were said there that made me, dare I say, feel old. Where I forgot the name of the person who was speaking on that episode, but he said, let me see here, yeah, AI might still pose new challenges. Well, sure, but not in a way that we might think about it like, are we going to lose jobs or whatever, or will I be replaced? No. He said it might pose new challenges for those of us who still want to date humans and face the risk of being gaslighted or manipulated. And this person was completely already seen on the side of, you know what, I can find my engagement with an AI if I need to, and I'm not going to get gaslighted. And just the matter-of-factness was just so interesting. Like, I don't know, yeah, I highly recommend reading that episode, because it goes a lot wider than just AI-human relationships, but it's very original perspectives, I thought, that were presented there. And the other transcript you produced was with a conversation with Su Min, who is a, by now, 60-year-old Chinese woman who at 56, I forgot. Anyway, late in life, almost retirement age in China, decided to leave her family. She was in an abusive relationship. She was treated as a housewife. I think the quote she had in that episode was, I was talked to when needed and forgotten when not. So she hit the road in China on her own. And that really resonated with a lot of people. There was a book published about her life. There's a movie made. Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about why you think Su Min's story resonates so much with not just your audience, but the wider audience in China, and what that says maybe about is it because a lot of women are in a similar situation and think like, hey, we're now an example that we can live up to maybe with Sumin.
Yeah, definitely. I think for the story of Sumin as a figure in the kind of we in Chinese we probably call her an 阿姨, so it's like an aunt figure. That she had that courage of restarting her life at the age of 56 is a very inspiring one. And I do see some universal value or universal appreciation in her case. Probably not just, women of her age group in China, and probably not just women in China, but worldwide. I feel there are a few layers. First, like for the feminism in China, for many years or many decades, the feminism side in like the feminism perspective in China has been has been overlooked or underestimated by both the government and the intellectuals. And so if you look at what kind of books have been translated from English language to Chinese language in the last 30 years, a lot of those liberal intellectuals in China who wanted to learn from Western society, they have been actively translating and introducing Western theories to Chinese audiences, including democracy, freedom of speech, labor rights. However, not so much book on feminism. So the feminism theory in China was only introduced, I would say, in the last 5 or 10 years. And that has something to do with the first generation of Chinese intellectuals. After Cultural Revolution, they were mostly male dominant. And nowadays, there are more and more women who want to find a framework to understand what is going on in their life, not just in what is in politics, but also in their private life. About their private decision. Do I want to have a kid? Can I find a job at a workplace? And if I am encountering some uncomfortable misbehavior from my boss, what can I do? Is it okay to feel how I feel? And I think that wave in China has started, I think roughly around maybe 2017, 2019, during this Me Too movement. And so I do feel there is that change or shift in the in how nowadays young women feel different from the earlier generation. And I think Sumin's example, it provides a very empowering and strong and vivid example to that wave. And the second one is that I do feel just generally speaking for everyone, living your life in the way you do for 2-3 decades, and there is a desire of changing it into a certain way, and but most of people are lack of the courage of really restarting or resetting your life. So, and I think that's probably the reason why it gets very widely recognized and also being very popular. That episode, because we later on we invited Sumin to be the guest of our podcast, and it's also a special guest for our podcast because most of the time our podcast audience are the group of young Chinese, aged between maybe 18 to 35, living in big city with good education, and or some of them living abroad, and so often you don't get to hear people from Suming's age group to speak. So what was really touching for me was that that episode, I heard from some friends that they can forward that episode to their mother. So to create a link for the mother and daughter, and saying, okay, you know, here's a figure, like assuming you can restart your life whenever you want.
Right.
So that was a very touching moment for me to share this kind of story existing.
I can imagine. It's by the way, if any of you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'm going to ask one more, but then I'll get to as many of you as possible, if that's all right. But I was wondering, Qing, having done this for 6 years now, having produced so many episodes, having had so many conversations with so many people from the age group, mainly 18, 35-year-old Chinese people, we've already touched a lot upon the general tone of the podcast, which isn't too upbeat, not too pop. But does that make you, I wonder, worried or hopeful still for this generation that is your audience and the opportunities they might have? Do you think there's, dare I say, light at the end of the tunnel for many of them, or are you kind of worried, like, I don't see this improving anytime soon for them? There's this sense of disillusionment and
yeah, I think that's $1 million question. I don't think I have the answer. And I think what we talk about on the podcast is, I think one central thing we talk about in the podcast is that we wanna you to feel the weight. We want you to think about the things, you know, that touches social injustice or inequality. We want you to be aware of those things existing, but we definitely don't encourage an approach of being cynical.
Right.
So the whole point of raising those issues, the end goal is to encourage everyone to act, to take action. Actually, in the Ukraine episode, maybe you can feel that like both of our analysts are quite are being disappointed and feel quite disappointed both about, you know, how the war is going and also the lack of support from the West. And then they asked me, Qing, do you feel differently? And I would say, of course, I feel very sad and very upset about what's going on in a situation like Ukraine. But I do feel also empowered when I actually take the time to make that trip to Ukraine. So I've been to Ukraine a few times after the war broke out, and it was not really easy to go as a Chinese journalist, as an independent journalist. And I had the fear, I had the despair before going. But when I'm actually on the ground, I felt quite empowered. Because like that's the moment you can actually start doing something. You're doing an interview, and you know, while you're doing this interview, you are bringing those like stories to your audiences, and your audiences will hear it, and they may, you know, take some action to make some donation, or they're more informed about what's going on in Ukraine and because of China's role there. So it's very important for the bigger Chinese audiences to be aware of what's going on. And so if you think about that chain, like every simple action you take will have a bigger impact. And also I feel that when I was in Ukraine, I was just chatting with Heidi and New York the other day about, you know, the thing I saw in Kiev, like the people who are not at the front line fighting for the war. They were working really hard, like in cities like Kiev, like some of the cafe open at 5 a.m. And I was so surprised because no cafe opens at 5 a.m. in the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. If they open at 9 a.m., they're like, oh, we're pretty early. And so
they're more likely to close at 5 a.m., I think. In the
other than the nightclub, yeah. And so I do feel coming to my, I think my personal principle of, covering all the stories is not to present a very depressing picture to my audiences. I think if it stops there, then the work I do is kind of pointless. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't stop there, and it should bring actions. And I was in New York a few weeks ago, and with the U.S. politics, and everyone's kind of also depressed. And I asked, "Did you vote?" And I didn't vote. And I was like, "Why didn't you vote? Yeah. You have the right to vote. And if you don't vote, don't complain." Mm-hmm. And so I think that's like the kind of general mentality that I want to bring to the group of audiences I'm engaging with. And again, coming back to your question, I don't think I have an answer. If there is a bright future for the lost generation of young Chinese, I think if there is a bright future, it should come from them. Mm-hmm. Like they should feel the urge. Okay, if we want to have a bright future, we need to take action now. So, right. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to be clear, it's the Weirdo is definitely not a bunch of people crying in the corner how bad the world is and how
I hope no.
Without vision, the future
I'd be heartbroken if that's the case.
No, not at all. And like you said, you reported on your trips to Kiev, and you even had some clinical geopolitical analysis in there. So it's really a very wide spectrum overall. Just want to make that clear.
Trump's continued face-off with the courts has some questioning whether the U.S. has reached the point of a constitutional crisis. On that and more, we turn to the analysis of Brooks and Capehart. That's New York Times columnist David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart, associate editor of The Washington Post. Good evening, gentlemen. Nice to have you both. I want to talk about President Trump and the courts. I mean, the president has wielded his authority in, I think, by any measure, in an extraordinary way, slashing budgets and jobs across the federal government, targeting billions of dollars at colleges and universities, threatening major law firms. On immigration, we've all been following that remarkable process. But the courts, David, in many instances, have stood up to the president. Do you think that they are doing their appropriate role of check and balance?
Yeah, I think they are. The question is whether Trump pays any attention to the courts. And so to me, watching the Trump administration is just like watching the administration say, we've decided stoplights don't apply to us. Yellow lines down the middle of the road don't apply. We're just going to roll over it, and you stop us. And when you think constitutional crisis, you think like two sides facing off on the barricades. But I've actually lived through a constitutional crisis. When I was at the Wall Street Journal, I covered the end of the Soviet Union. And it was obviously very different in many ways. But one thing was interesting, the mental adjustment I had to make. When I went to the Soviet Union...
The mental adjustment?
Yeah, at the very end. Because I grew up in a country where I assume if a law is passed, then things will change. It will be enforced, and it'll be a reality on the ground. But at the very end of the Soviet Union, they would pass law after law, and nothing happened. Nobody bothered to enforce it. It never had any implementation. So the laws were fictional because people had lost faith in the laws, lost faith in the whole system. And so what happens now is not that you get this big conflict, but Trump just says, we're going to arrest a guy who give him no due process. And there's like no confrontation, it just happens. And nobody's there to stop it because famously the judiciary doesn't have an army.
Right. Jonathan, what do you think about that? I mean, we had Georgetown law professor Steve Vladeck on the show. He says we're not quite there yet because the Trump administration has not yet formally blown through, overtly ignored a direct court order yet. But we also heard from the League of Women Voters, the nonpartisan organization, who this week, I'd like to read you this quote. They said, quote, "It has now been 87 days since the start of the Trump administration. from the flagrant disregard for congressional authority and governmental checks and balances to defying Supreme Court orders to bring Kilmar Abrego Garcia back home. One thing is abundantly clear. Our country is in a constitutional crisis. Where do you come down on that?
I am glad you read that, because I was nodding in agreement with the League of Women Voters. How can you say that the president hasn't, defied court orders? You've got Judge Boasberg, who is threatening says yesterday that there's probable cause to charge the government, or lawyers arguing on behalf of the government, with criminal contempt. Why? Because the president of the United States and his administration ignored his order to not deport those folks to El Salvador. So I know there are these formal definitions of what a constitutional crisis is, but from where I sit in my schoolhouse rock knowledge of how our government is supposed to work, we are in one. We have a president of the United States who on a daily basis blows past the guardrails, pushes as far as he can get to test the system. And what has heartened me this week is hearing from Judge Boasberg and the judge who ruled yesterday in that beautiful 7-page opinion, where they are not just saying this isn't the right thing to do, they are pushing back just as aggressively from their respective federal benches, and I think we will be better for it.
Do you think, David, that I have been reading some Republican voices saying, specifically on the Abrego Garcia case, that this might be a bridge too far, that they feel that this simply jumping over due process completely. Do you think that there will be, from the right, some real critique that's meaningful?
It depends if you have the kind of job where you have to get elected to hold it. And so one of the things I've been struck by is that a lot of things Trump has done, the experts have said, this is crazy. And when Ukraine, the Zelensky meeting in the Oval Office, Republican and Democratic foreign policy experts said this is crazy. The tariffs, Republican and Democratic experts said this is crazy. The Garcia case, Republican and Democratic constitutional scholars say this is crazy. But as for elected officials, I would say we have not yet seen that. I have to assume from what I know of them personally is that they are personally appalled, but they're doing what they've been doing for all the years that Trump has been around.
Although we have seen one, Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, who is no shrinking violet when it comes to going toe-to-toe with President Trump or standing up to her own leadership. And she is on camera, on record, saying, we're all afraid. And that's
we actually have that. Let's play what she had to say. This is Senator Lisa Murkowski, Senator of Alaska. Let's listen to what she's doing.
We are all afraid. Okay. I'm oftentimes very anxious myself about using my voice because retaliation is real.
Retaliation is real.
And that's what Republicans in the House and the Senate and all over the country, elected ones, have been dealing with since Trump won. And I think the fact that we have that on camera from Senator Murkowski, I hope it will give other elected Republicans the courage to say even that, to acknowledge to the American people that we see what's happening, we know what's going on, we know it's crazy and wrong, but gotta be honest, we're scared. We're not quite sure what to do, although what they should be doing, we all know.
Well, you offered a prescription, David, in your column in the New York Times for this moment that we are in, and you called for a civic uprising. You said in this column, I want to read a bit of this, saying that the attacks that we've seen on institutions, quote, are not separate battles. This is a simple effort to undo the parts of the civilizational order that might restrain Trump's acquisition of power. So how would that civic uprising form?
Yeah, the core argument is that Trump is really about amassing power, and anything that might potentially restrain his power, he will destroy. And that includes the court systems, and anything part of that livens humanity, includes the universities, the scientific community, the truth, the media. And so far, we've responded to all these things, like NATO, and in separate lanes. We think the Fed is different than NATO, which is different from the universities. But my point is, this is all one thing. And if institutions and even sectors try to respond to this individually, they're doomed. Even Harvard, with $52 billion in its endowment, you can't do it alone.
Though that was a signal moment.
That was a crucial turning point because it changed the minds of everybody in every university I've talked to since then. They said,
oh, really?
Yeah. So
post-Harvard, they've all said.
A lot of them beforehand were like, well, Columbia made a deal. Maybe that's right for us. Once Harvard came out, I talked to a couple of university presidents who said, oh, this is where we need to be. Because the Trump administration made it impossible for Harvard not to say no. And that's what we're dealing with here. And so the point I tried to make is all these different sectors have to get together and form one big civic movement. And it can't be political. It's not Democrats versus Republicans. It's not left versus right. It's institutions versus the destruction of our institutions of civilization. And if you look down through history, there have been social movements, these kind of civic uprisings, that have succeeded. They've banded together across sectors. They have a clear, simple message that appeals to a lot of different people. They use things like lawsuits, protests, boycotts, all sorts of things, strikes, anything they can do. But basically, if you're head of a law firm or a university, any of these institutions, you're dealing with administrations, it's just about raw power. So the question you have to ask yourself is, how do we amass power so they're not dividing us, so we're dividing them? And that is a mass uprising. And the one turning point, if you look even at the civil rights movement, when you do a nonviolent protest and the people on the other side attack you with violence, that tends to weaken them. And then suddenly you're dividing them, Selma, obviously. And so this is the kind of way we have to think, that it's time not just to think, well, maybe he'll look at the other guy. It's time we're all involved, we're all in this together, and we're going to amass power together.
Jonathan, do you think that movement, that uprising is going to happen? I mean, we saw protests recently. There are major protests planned for tomorrow. Do you think that there is this coalescing energy that David is talking about? I think it's
happening, and I think it started when people were showing up outside of USAID when they were going through hell. I think we're seeing it in the town halls in Republican districts, so much so that the leadership told Republican members of Congress, don't hold town halls anymore. We've seen it with the big rallies in red states convened by Senator Bernie Sanders and AOC in red states. I think just yesterday or 2 days ago in Montana, hundreds, if not thousands of people. And then you look at what's happening, and I know the courts and the judges are impartial, but they are also part of this pushing back on what's happening. And then for Harvard to do what it did, I think sent a message not just to university presidents, but to the country that if Harvard had folded, it would have been a devastating thing, but it didn't happen. And I would just say this one last point. In Trump 1, Adam Serwer wrote, famously, the cruelty is the point about the first Trump administration. And I would argue that in Trump 2, it's now the cruelty is the policy. And I think what we're seeing around the country is people pushing back against Trump 2.
Jonathan Capehart, David Brooks, always good to see you both. Thank you.
Thanks.
See you.
From dysfunction at the Department of Defense to a judge in Wisconsin being arrested by the FBI, it's shaped up to be quite the week. Luckily, here to break it all down, I'm joined by Brooks and Capehart. That is New York Times columnist David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart, associate editor for the Washington Post. It's great to see you both. So, David, I want to start off with you because in the last for almost 100 days in now to his presidency, just in this last week, we saw a bit of a reversal or a walk back from President Trump on a couple of stances. One was a sort of softening on the rhetoric towards China and the trade war. And the other, as Laura reported earlier, the administration abruptly reversing itself on the potential cancellation of thousands of foreign student visas. I don't mean to connect these two in any way. They are not connected, but they did happen this week. And I just wonder, as you reflect on where they are now, what this says to you about how the administration is processing feedback and who they're listening to.
Right. It suggests, well, as we learned in Trump 1, they don't have a long-term strategy. There's no policy process. We're going to do this, and then we're going to stick through it no matter who says what. They just don't do that. Trump is instinctive. He responds to the moment. And the lesson for people who want to defend institutions, whether you're a university, whether you're a law firm, whether you're a scientific research center, whether you're a business who doesn't like what tariffs are doing to your business, is that you can throw sand in the gears of this administration and they will respond. They're going to do what they want to do. But people who oppose what they want to do and want to defend American institutions can do lawsuits, they can do lobbying, there can be leaking, there can be protests. There are all these things that can happen, and they've proven this week they will have an effect. Donald Trump listened to, like, the CEO of Walmart. He listens to the polls. He listens when there's all these lawsuits. He listened to something about the international students. Now, that doesn't say things are going back to normal. The tariffs are still higher. If you're in a university, your international students are still in jeopardy. But it shows what can be done, that there is possibility for an opposition to Trump to have successes if they can apply just relentless pressure.
Jonathan, what do you make of that? You take away the same lessons?
Yes, I do. You know, David had a great column today in the New York Times where he talked about, you know, what the opposition should do in the face of an administration that hit the ground running. And the whole point of this administration has been to flood the zone, confuse everybody, confound everybody, and get as much done and through the gates as possible before the opposition has a chance to recover. And right now what we've been seeing is not just the opposition recovering, but the American people deciding that they don't exactly like what they see. A raft of polls has started coming out in anticipation of the president's first 100 days, and on the economy and on immigration, the two issues he ran on or said he was going to run on and change things immediately, he is now underwater in at least two polls that come to mind. But we're going to see more, if not later today, then over the weekend, showing that the president is losing ground on the two issues he campaigned on.
Meanwhile, David, as Laura also reported earlier, this is other story we're tracking.